The cockpit of the Bf-109G-6 was a cramped, familiar world of cold metal, the sharp scent of oil, and the constant, reassuring vibration of the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, at 22 years old with 148 confirmed kills, painted in neat black rings on the rudder of his Carrier-1, scanned the deep blue expanse above the Cuban River. It was March 8, 1943. The air was so clear he could see the faint, distant shimmer of the Black Sea to the southwest. His wingman, Feldwebel Walter Krupinski, a wild man they called Count Punski, was a dark green speck off his right wing, rocking his wings slightly in a gesture of boredom. "Nothing but crows and clouds today, Bubai," Krupinski's voice crackled through the leather headset, using Hartmann's affectionate squadron nickname. "The Ivans are hiding. Maybe they heard the Black Devil was on patrol." Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile. The Soviet Air Force had learned to fear his particular style of hunting: get dangerously close, hold fire until the enemy fighter filled his reflector sight, then a short, devastating burst from the 109's 20 cannon and twin machine guns. It was a marksman's game, demanding nerves of steel and supreme confidence in one's machine. His confidence in the Messerschmitt was absolute. For 2 years, from the skies of the Ukraine to the Caucasus, the Bf-109 had been his extension, a razor-sharp scalpel in the hands of a master surgeon. It was lighter, more nimble in a turning fight at medium altitude, and piloted by men whose survival depended on skill honed in hundreds of deadly engagements. The Americans, to the extent he thought of them at all, were a distant rumor, a theoretical opponent flying clumsy, heavy machines like the Airacobra, which German intelligence reports dismissed as inferior to even early model 109s. A flicker of movement caught his eye, low and to the east, not the angular silhouette of a Yak or Lajiji. This was something bulkier, with a distinctive, deep fuselage and a radial engine cowling that glinted in the sun. Hartmann's mind, a catalog of aircraft recognition, supplied the name: Bell P-39 Airacobra, a lone straggler perhaps. The intelligence bulletins were clear. The Airacobra was slow, poorly armed except for its nose-mounted cannon, and a death trap above 15,000 feet where its lack of a proper turbo-supercharger strangled its engine. "Contact 10 o'clock low," Hartmann transmitted, his voice calm. "One Airacobra, looks lost." Krupinski's chuckle was audible. "An afternoon snack, shall we?" This was the established order. This was the reality of the Eastern Front in early 1943 for an ace of Hartmann's caliber. The enemy aircraft were targets, not threats. The technological edge, the tactical brilliance, the sheer killer instinct resided in the cockpits of the Jagdgeschwader. What none of them in that crystalline Cuban sky could possibly comprehend was that this lone, seemingly vulnerable P-39 represented the bleeding edge of a seismic shift in aerial warfare. It was a precursor, a flawed herald of a doctrine so radically different, so utterly alien to the German philosophy of elite pilots in refined machines, that it would soon render their hard-won expertise terrifyingly obsolete. The Americans were not just building airplanes. They were building a system, an industrial and logistical tsunami that valued quantity, survivability, and pilot preservation in ways the Luftwaffe High Command, steeped in tales of individual heroism, found conceptually incomprehensible. And the first terrifying wave of that new reality was already rolling off production lines thousands of miles away, bearing a name that would soon become a curse in German fighter circles: Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The confidence that bordered on arrogance in the hearts of men like Hartmann was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of staggering success. By the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm on the Eastern Front was arguably the most lethal concentration of aerial combat experience in history. Pilots like Hartmann, Barkhorn, Rahl, and Kittel had amassed kill totals that defied belief, often against numerically superior Soviet forces. The tactics developed by legends like Werner Mölder's, the Schwarm four-ship formation, and the Rot two-ship element provided a flexible, lethal framework. The Bf-109, particularly the new G model with its more powerful engine and heavier armament, was a known quantity, a trusted weapon. German intelligence assessments of Western Allied aircraft, distilled from combat reports over North Africa and limited encounters over occupied Europe, painted a reassuring picture. A captured Allied document from 1942, circulated among Luftwaffe intelligence officers, summarized the American fighter philosophy as over-engineered, overweight, and underarmed compared to their intended role. The report specifically mocked the P-39 Airacobra for its car-like door and tricycle landing gear, calling it a novel design unsuited for serious combat. The P-40 Warhawk was considered obsolete. The early model P-38 Lightnings encountered over North Africa had shown troubling speed, but were reported to be vulnerable in a dive and clumsy in a turn. As for the new American fighters rumored to be in development, the consensus in Berlin was dismissive. The Americans, it was believed, lacked the combat experience to design a truly effective fighter. Their industrial might would produce quantity, surely, but quality. That was a German prerogative. This cultural and technical bias ran deep. A memo from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Gallen's office in late 1942, commenting on reconnaissance photos of new American aircraft plants, stated, "The American method favors mass production of simplified designs. This will inevitably result in aircraft that are crude, lacking the refined performance characteristics necessary for air superiority against our seasoned pilots." The Japanese held similar convictions, believing the American fighting spirit to be inferior, eroded by materialism and comfort. This wasn't just military assessment, it was a profound failure of imagination. They were evaluating the next war with the tools and doctrines of the last one. A few dissenting voices existed, but they were systematically ignored. Oberst Edgar Peterson, commander of the Erprobungsstelle Richlin Flight Test Center, had grown increasingly concerned by fragmented reports from the Channel Front. In the autumn of 1942, his engineers analyzed gun camera footage from a Focke-Wulf FW-190 that had engaged what was identified as a P-47 over deep. The Thunderbolt, after being hit, had entered a near-vertical dive and simply vanished, pulling away from the pursuing 190 with what the pilot described as unearthly acceleration. Peterson's subsequent report, suggesting the new American fighter might possess exceptional high-altitude performance and dive capabilities, was filed under unverified anecdotal data by the Technisches Amt. The prevailing wisdom held that a fighter as large and heavy as the Thunderbolt was rumored to be could never be a dogfighter. It would be a slow, defenseless bomber-destroyer, nothing more. Peterson's warnings, like so many others, were buried under the weight of institutional certainty. That institutional certainty was about to collide with a force it had not factored into any of its equations: the unchecked, innovative, and staggeringly productive might of American industry, unleashed by a nation that had decided to win not by building a better sword, but by forging an entire armory in a single, continuous, deafening roar. While German aces added notches to their canopies, a revolution was taking shape not in a secret laboratory, but in sprawling, deafening factories across the United States. It was a revolution of scale, standardization, and a fundamentally different design philosophy. The man who would become the father of the Thunderbolt was Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant, driven, Georgian-born aeronautical engineer at Republic Aviation. Kartveli didn't set out to build a delicate dogfighter. He was tasked with creating a high-altitude escort fighter, and he approached the problem with a brutalist's logic. If the engine is the heart of a fighter, he reasoned, then give it the biggest, most powerful heart possible. He selected the monstrous Pratt & Whitney RMS 2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. But to make that engine breathe at 30,000 feet, where German bombers flew and their fighters intercepted, he needed a turbo-supercharger. This wasn't a minor addition. It was an engineering masterpiece. The turbo-supercharger system on the P-47 was a labyrinth of ductwork that ran from the engine, through an intricate exhaust-driven turbine mounted in the rear fuselage, and back through an intercooler to the engine's intake. It gave the Thunderbolt a critical advantage no German fighter could match. Its power didn't diminish with altitude. In fact, it thrived up there. While the Bf-109G SDB-605 engine wheezed and lost power above 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's RMS-2800, force-fed by the turbo, delivered full, crushing power all the way to its operational ceiling of over 40,000 feet. This one feature made the P-47 a predator in a domain the Luftwaffe had considered its own. But Kartvel's genius extended beyond the engine bay. He built the Thunderbolt like a flying tank. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plate. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The pilot sat in a bathtub of steel. The aircraft's structure was immensely strong, capable of withstanding forces that would tear the wings off a 109. This strength translated into a singular, terrifying capability: the dive. A Thunderbolt pilot, finding himself at a disadvantage, could simply point the aircraft's nose earthward and accelerate to speeds approaching 500 miles per hour in a matter of seconds. No German fighter could follow without risking catastrophic structural failure or compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt's weight, which German intelligence derided, was its salvation in the vertical dimension. Then there was the armament. German fighters typically carried a mix of cannon and machine guns, favoring the devastating hitting power of 20 and even 30 shells for bomber destruction. The Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber Browning M12 machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each gun fired at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. Combined, they unleashed a hailstorm of 13.2 grams of lead and steel every second. The 50 caliber round, while smaller than a cannon shell, had tremendous velocity and penetration. More importantly, the high rate of fire and generous ammunition supply, 425 rounds per gun, allowed for a greater margin of error. A German pilot had to make his short, precise burst count. A Thunderbolt pilot could walk his torrent of fire onto a target, saturating an area with deadly metal. It was the difference between a sniper's rifle and a shotgun at close range. The production numbers were where the theoretical became the apocalyptic. While Messerschmitt's Regensburg factory, under constant threat of bombing, struggled to produce 200 Bf-109s a month, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale, New York plant was hitting a stride that defied German comprehension. By mid-1943, they were completing 15 P-47s per day. A new Thunderbolt rolled off the line every 96 minutes. The production was so streamlined that the aircraft were often flown directly from the factory floor to modification centers for final combat preparation. This wasn't craftsman's IP, it was hydraulics. It was the relentless, deafening heartbeat of a nation that had mobilized its entire industrial soul for war. Hartmann pushed the throttle forward, the DB-600, and Fives growled deepening as he began a shallow, energy-conserving descent toward the lone Airacobra. Krupinski slid into position behind and above, covering the tail. This was the dance they had performed 100 times. The Soviet pilot, apparently oblivious, continued on a westerly heading, the sun glinting off his canopy. Hartmann's eyes narrowed behind his goggles, his mind calculating the intercept geometry with unconscious ease. He would come in from the sun, a slight altitude advantage, a gentle curve that would place the P-39 perfectly in his Rivy reflector sight. He could already picture the strikes, the engine cowling shredding, the glycol coolant erupting in a white plume, the aircraft snapping into a fatal spin. Another ring for the rudder. Maybe number 149 would be a quick one. But as the distance closed, a sliver of unease, foreign and cold, threaded its way through Hartman's focus. The Airacobra wasn't behaving like a lost, sluggish target. It was moving with a purposeful, steady speed that seemed wrong. The intelligence report said the P-39 was a dog below 10,000 feet, but this one was holding its own at nearly 15,000. And there was a solidity to its flight, a lack of the slight yaw or wobble he associated with less stable designs. He shook the feeling off. Intel was rarely perfect. Perhaps this was a newer model. It didn't matter. No Airacobra could outturn or outclimb a clean 109G-6. He was a kilometer out, merging perfectly. The P-39's silhouette grew in his sight, the distinctive car door canopy, the long nose. He thumbed the safety off the cannon and machine guns. 600 meters, 400, the perfect killing range. He began to squeeze the trigger. The world exploded. The Airacobra didn't try to turn. It didn't climb. It simply ceased to exist as a target and became a blur of violent motion. The nose dropped as if severed, and the bulky aircraft seemed to fall out of the sky. Not a dive, but a sheer, weight-assisted plummet. Hartman's perfectly aimed burst shredded empty air where the fighter had been a heartbeat before. His own aircraft shuddered through the sudden negative G-force. "Verdammt," Krupinski's voice shouted in his ears. "He's going straight down." Hartman, instinct screaming, shoved his own stick forward, the 109 nosing over to follow. The altimeter began to unwind with alarming speed. 14,000, 13,500, 13,000. The Airacobra was a dark, shrinking cross below him, accelerating at a rate that seemed physically impossible. The DB-605 was howling at full military power, the airframe beginning to vibrate, but the distance wasn't closing, it was increasing. The P-39 was pulling away. Not just pulling away, but vanishing into the haze below like a stone dropped into a well. "Break off, Bubai," Krupinski yelled. "You'll rip the wings off." At 12,000 feet, with his airspeed nudging 750 kilometers per hour, and the controls growing dangerously heavy, Hartman wrenched back on the stick, his vision graying at the edges from the G-force. He pulled out of the dive, his lungs burning, the wings groaning in protest. He leveled out, sweat cooling on his forehead beneath the leather helmet. Below, the Airacobra had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the landscape. The Cuban sky was once again empty and serene. For a long moment, there was only the rush of wind and the thrum of his own engine. The kill that had been a certainty 10 seconds ago was gone. Not just gone, but humiliatingly outmaneuvered in the one arena, the vertical, where the 109 was supposed to reign supreme. "What in God's name was that?" Krupinski said, pulling up alongside, his own aircraft shaking from the strain. "Did you see that dive? No Airacobra can do that. It must have been something else. A yak with a new profile." Hartman stared at the empty space where the American fighter had vanished. The cold sliver of unease had become an ice pick in his gut. He had seen the aircraft clearly. It was a P-39, but it had performed an act of physics that his understanding of aviation said was impossible for a P-39. The intelligence was wrong, not slightly wrong, but fundamentally catastrophically wrong. "It was an Airacobra," Hartman said, his voice quiet in the headset, "but it was not the aircraft in the bulletins." They orbited the area for another 10 minutes, but the sky remained empty. The mission log would record: encountered single P-39 at 15,000 feet, evaded via high-speed dive. No engagement, no kill ring would be painted. But for Erich Hartmann, something far more valuable had been stolen: his absolute certainty. The first crack had appeared in the wall of German aerial invincibility, and it had been delivered not by a swarm of Soviet aircraft, but by a single, misunderstood American machine. It was a tiny, personal preview. The real storm was still months away, and it was coming from the west. That storm's first thunderclap echoed not over the Cuban, but over the patchwork fields of western France on April 15, 1943. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a veteran with 150 victories and commander of II/JG-52, had just been transferred to the defense of the Reich, leading a swarm of 4 Bf-109 G6s from his new base at Jever. He was vectored to intercept a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses reported heading for Bremen. This was a different war from the east. Here, the enemy came in vast, stacked boxes, trailing contrails and defended by a hail of 50 caliber fire from a dozen gun positions. The tactic was the head-on attack, a terrifying joust requiring nerves of iron, a closing speed of over 800 kilometers per hour, and a precise, fleeting burst aimed at the cockpit or engines. Steinhoff spotted the bomber stream, a dark constellation of specks glinting in the high-altitude sun at 28,000 feet. But between them and the bombers, flying lazy, weaving patterns above the contrail layer, were the escorts. They looked like nothing he had ever seen. From a distance they appeared huge, their radial engines giving them a blunt, pugnacious profile. They glinted in the sun, not with the sleek, polished aluminum of a 109, but with a duller, painted sheen. Achtung, Indianer, his wingman called. Hi, 12 o'clock, big ones. Probably more of those twin-engine lightnings, Steinhoff replied, though a knot tightened in his stomach. The silhouettes were wrong for P-38s. They were thicker, heavier. We'll take them from above. Remember, break away after the pass. Do not turn with them. He led his 4 109s into a climbing turn, aiming to gain a slight altitude advantage over the escorts. The plan was classic: a diving pass to break up the escort screen, then a second pass on the bombers. At 30,000 feet, the thin, cold air made his engine feel sluggish. The American fighters, however, seemed utterly unfazed. They maintained their altitude and patrol speed with an ease that was unnerving. Steinhoff picked the trailing fighter in the enemy formation. I'll take the one on the left. Lows. He rolled inverted and pulled the nose down, the 109 gathering speed in the dive. The big American fighter swelled in his sight. He could see the details now. The massive four-bladed propeller, the deep fuselage, the 8 dark muzzles of machine guns clustered in the wings. It was a P-47 Thunderbolt. The name from the dismissed reports flickered in his mind a second before he fired. His cannon shells and machine gun rounds traced toward the cockpit, and then the world dissolved into a storm of metal. The Thunderbolt didn't break. It didn't evade. The pilot simply rolled slightly, and as Steinhoff's 109 shot past, the entire rear hemisphere of the sky behind the American fighter seemed to erupt. A solid river of 50 caliber tracers, thick as ropes, hosed through the air where Steinhoff's flight path had been. The volume of fire was stupefying. It was not a burst. It was a continuous, sustained deluge that lasted 3 full seconds. The air was filled with incandescent streaks. Steinhoff's wingman, Lieutenant Faber, was not as lucky. Pulling up from his own pass, he drifted for a fraction of a second into that torrent. The effect was not the localized damage of a cannon hit. Faber's Bf-109 appeared to fly into a solid wall of hammers. The left wing disintegrated into a cloud of fragments. The tail assembly sheared off. The fuselage, riddled with dozens of fist-sized holes, snapped in half behind the cockpit. The aircraft didn't burn. It simply came apart in the air, scattering debris across 5 miles of sky. Faber had no chance to bail out. Faber is hit. He's gone, someone screamed over the radio. Steinhoff, his heart hammering against his ribs, hauled his 109 into a climbing turn, looking for the threat. The Thunderbolt that had killed his wingman was already turning back toward the bombers, its pilot seemingly unconcerned. It had expended perhaps a tenth of its ammunition in that one devastating hose down. Another P-47, seeing Steinhoff's turn, banked toward him. Steinhoff, a master of angles, positioned for a deflection shot. The 109 was still more nimble. He had him. He led the turning thunderbolt, fired a perfect economical burst. He saw strikes, sparks and flashes along the thunderbolt's right wing root and fuselage. A hit. That should have been enough. A 20-mine shell exploding inside a wing would cripple any fighter. The P-47 shuddered, a puff of smoke or coolant vapor whipped away by the slipstream. And then it kept turning. It didn't break off. It didn't spiral down. It completed the turn, its 8 guns now coming to bear on Steinhoff. The German ace felt a primal chill. It should be dead. He broke hard, diving away. The thunderbolt followed, but not in a turn. It nosed down, and within seconds it was gone, accelerating downward in a dive so steep and fast it seemed to warp the air around it. Steinhoff, at 25,000 feet, knew better than to follow. He leveled off, his aircraft damaged, his fuel low, his mind reeling. He had scored a direct hit on a fighter that, by all rights, should have been destroyed. The fighter had absorbed the hit and not only remained airborne, but had continued the fight. And its dive, it was the same impossible, physics-defying escape he had heard whispers about from the east. He regrouped with his 2 remaining pilots. They had not engaged the bombers. The mere presence of these new escorts had completely thwarted the mission. One Bf-109 was lost, another damaged, for 0 enemy casualties. As they turned for home, Steinhoff looked back at the bomber stream, now disappearing into the haze, surrounded by their circling, monstrous guardians. The equation had changed. The sanctuary of altitude above 25,000 feet, where German fighters had once been relatively safe from escort, was now contested by something that owned the vertical dimension. On the ground at Jever, the debriefing was a somber, tense affair. Steinhoff stood before the Grupp intelligence officer, a map spread on the table. "The reports on the P-47 are false," Steinhoff said, his voice flat. "It is not slow, it is not clumsy, it is fast in a dive, faster than anything we have. Its armament, it is like being shot at by a fire hose, and it can absorb tremendous punishment. I hit one squarely. It flew away." The intelligence officer, a captain who had never flown a combat mission, tapped the folder on his desk. "Herr Hauptmann, the technical assessment from Richlin states the P-47's maximum dive speed is limited by its weight. It cannot maneuver with our aircraft. You must have encountered a different type, or perhaps the new P-51. Steinhoff leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "I know what I saw. It was a P-47, and it did not read your technical assessment." The dismissive reports continued to flow from Berlin, but in the squadrons facing the American 8th Air Force, a different reality was hardening into accepted truth. The statistics began to tell the story that headquarters refused to hear. In May 1943, the average loss ratio for Luftwaffe fighters engaging P-47 escorted bomber formations was 1.5, 1 in favor of the Americans. By July, as more Thunderbolt groups became operational and their pilots refined their tactics, using their superior speed and dive to make slashing, hit-and-run attacks rather than turning fights, that ratio worsened to 2.8, 1. In August, during the brutal double strike on Regensburg and Schweinfurt, where P-47s provided deep escort thanks to newly introduced auxiliary fuel tanks, the ratio spiked to a catastrophic 4.7, 1. For every Thunderbolt lost, nearly 5 German fighters were shot down. The human cost was immediate and devastating. The veterans, the irreplaceable experts with hundreds of missions, began to fall at an alarming rate. On August 17, 1943, the same day as the Schweinfurt raid, Major Wolfgang Ewald, a 78 victory ace and Gruppenkommandeur of II/JG3, was shot down and killed by P-47s near Brussels. Oberleutnant Max Stotz, a 189 victory ace and Knight's Cross holder, fell to Thunderbolts on August 19 over Holland. Each loss was a microcosm of the new imbalance. Stotz, a master of deflection shooting, had gotten onto the tail of a P-47. He fired his usual lethal burst. The thunderbolt, streaming coolant and smoke, dove away. Stotts, believing the kill was assured, followed. The damaged P-47, diving at over 500 miles per hour, pulled away from the pursuing 109 with ease. Stotts, frustrated, pulled out of his dive at low altitude and was instantly set upon by two other thunderbolts that had pounced from high cover. The experienced hunter had become the prey, trapped by the very tactic his own aircraft could not match. The psychological impact was profound. A captured diary from a Feldwebel in JG-26, found near Calais in September 1943, contained this entry. "We call them jabos, but that is too kind. They are flying fortresses themselves. You pour your heart into an attack, you see your shots strike, and it means nothing. They just dive away or turn and spray that incredible fire at you. Rabeck says we must attack from above and never ever follow them down. But how? They are always above us now. The sky feels crowded, and every day there are more of them. New faces in the briefing room replace the old ones, and the new boys are pale and quiet. They do not have 50 victories. They have 20 hours on the 109. The failure of imagination was now a hemorrhage of experienced men. The Luftwaffe's training system, already strained, could not keep up. In 1942, a German fighter pilot might receive over 250 hours of flight training before joining a combat unit. By late 1943, that had been slashed to under 150 hours. The replacements arriving at the front were boys, skilled enough to fly the aircraft but lacking the hundreds of hours of tactical training and aerial gunnery practice that had forged the earlier aces. They were sent up against American pilots who, while perhaps lacking the sheer dogfighting artistry of a Hartmann, had been trained in a system that emphasized formation flying, gunnery, and the specific strengths of their aircraft. And they flew in numbers that seemed limitless. The perspective from the ground was equally grim. Oberleutnant Friedrich Kellner, an engineering officer attached to a Jagdschwader in France, was tasked in October 1943 with examining the wreckage of a P-47D that had crash-landed relatively intact near Abbeville. What he and his team discovered in that torn-open fuselage was a revelation that bordered on despair. The report he filed, stamped Geheim Secret, was a technical obituary for German fighter superiority. "The aircraft is built not like a precision instrument, but like a ship," he wrote. "The skin gauge is approximately 1.5 times that of a Bf-109. The cockpit armor is a sealed tub of 12 steel plate, not bolted add-ons. The control cables are duplicated and run separately on either side of the fuselage. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney RMS-2800, is mounted on a framework that allows for easy removal and replacement. The turbo supercharger system, it is an engineering work of art. The complexity is immense, but it is built in a modular fashion. The entire unit can be detached and swapped in a matter of hours." He detailed the armament: 850 caliber machine guns, each with 425 rounds of ammunition. The feed mechanisms are simple and reliable. The guns are heated electrically to prevent freezing at altitude. The ammunition is a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary, giving each round a high probability of causing damage. The weight of fire this system can deliver in a 2-second burst is approximately 18 kilograms of metal. A Bf-109G's entire ammunition load for its cannon and machine guns weighs 22 kilograms. The most devastating conclusion was not about quality, but about philosophy. "This aircraft is not designed to be the best fighter in the sky," Kellner wrote. "It is designed to be a survivable fighter that can be produced in overwhelming numbers. Every component is overbuilt. Every system has redundancy. It is easy to repair in the field. It keeps its pilot alive. Our design philosophy seeks perfection in a few machines. Theirs seeks adequacy in thousands of machines, with the understanding that quantity has a quality all its own. We are fighting against an industrial logic we cannot defeat." This industrial logic manifested in ways that crushed morale. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, a Panzer grenadier captured in Normandy in June 1944, described in his post-war interrogation a train journey he had taken while on leave in early 1944 through the industrial heartland of America as a prisoner being transferred. They took us past a place called Willow Run in Michigan. It was a single building. It stretched for over a mile. From the train, we could see the exit doors. A B-24 Liberator bomber emerged from that building, one after another, every 63 minutes. They were not assembling them, they were growing them like mushrooms. We sat on that train for an hour, and I counted 7 bombers roll out, followed by a line of P-51 fighters. My comrades and I did not speak. What was there to say? We had seen the entire output of a German aircraft plant for a month roll out of one American factory in a single morning. Back in the Reich, the High Command was trapped in a cycle of denial and desperate, belated reaction. The memos from Gallen's office grew increasingly frantic. A directive from November 1943 ordered, "All fighter pilots are strictly forbidden to engage P-47 Thunderbolts in turning fights, or to attempt to follow them in a dive. Attacks are to be made from altitude advantage only, and disengagement must be immediate." It was an admission of inferiority, a order to run from a fair fight. For pilots raised on the offensive ethos of the Jagdflieger, it was a bitter pill. Engineers worked furiously on responses. The Focke-Wulf Ta-152, a high-altitude interceptor with a pressurized cockpit and a powerful engine, was rushed into development. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, a revolutionary leap ahead, was delayed by Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber. Even when it finally entered service in 1944, its impact was blunted by crippling fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and its own vulnerability during takeoff and landing, precisely when the ever-present Thunderbolts and Mustangs were hunting. The German response was to build more exotic, complex, and ultimately unreliable wonder weapons, while the American response was to build more of what already worked. In 1944, Republic Aviation produced 6242 P-47s. Messerschmitt produced 2213 Bf-109s, but the comparison was worse than it appeared. Many of those 109s were the late-model K-4s, complex machines requiring scarce resources and skilled labor. The P-47s were rolling off lines operated by men and women who had never built an aircraft before 1941, using techniques of mass production borrowed from the automotive industry. The strategic impact was total and irreversible. The P-47, and later the longer-ranged P-51, achieved what the Luftwaffe High Command had deemed impossible. They cleared the skies over Germany. With air superiority established, the Allied tactical air forces, often flying the robust, ground attack optimized P-47D Jug, could roam at will over the battlefield. The effect on German ground forces was apocalyptic. A report from the German 7th Army in Normandy, July 1944, stated, "Movement by day is virtually impossible. Any concentration of vehicles is attacked within minutes by fighter bombers. The psychological effect on the troops is severe." They refer to the enemy air force as Der Total Jagbomber Terror, the total fighter bomber terror. Supply columns are destroyed, armor is pinned down, command and control is disrupted. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting the sky itself. The P-47's ability to carry bombs and rockets, and to survive heavy ground fire, made it the perfect instrument for this terror. A single Thunderbolt could deliver a 25 zero-pound bomb load with the accuracy of a dive bomber, then strafe the target with its 8 guns. German tanks, especially the heavier Panthers and Tigers, were formidable in head-on combat, but their thin top armor was vulnerable to the P-47's bombs and the plunging fire of its 50 caliber rounds. The Jabo became the most feared weapon on the Western Front. The final, crushing arithmetic was not just in aircraft lost, but in the irreversible shift in the war's tempo and direction. The time from the first encounters with the P-47 in early 1943 to the collapse of the Luftwaffe as an effective defensive force was less than 2 years. In that period, the United States produced 15,683 Thunderbolts. Luftwaffe pilots claimed approximately 1,234 of them destroyed in aerial combat, a testament to their skill even in the face of overwhelming odds. But in the process of achieving those kills, the Luftwaffe lost an estimated 48-71 fighters to P-47s alone. The exchange rate was nearly 4-1. And for every German fighter pilot killed or captured, there was no fully trained replacement. For every P-47 pilot lost, there were 3 more graduating from flight school and 10 new aircraft waiting for them. The war in the air was lost not in a dramatic, singular air battle, but in a relentless, grinding process of industrial attrition. The German fighter arm, the most skilled and lethal in the world in 1942, was bled white. By early 1945, the skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled. New jets sat idle on bomb-cratered runways. Veteran aces were ordered into the air in hopeless, last-ditch missions against armadas of thousands of bombers and fighters. Erich Hartmann, the young ace who had encountered that puzzling P-39 over the Cuban, survived the war. He would become the highest-scoring ace in history, with 352 confirmed victories, almost all on the Eastern Front. But even his unparalleled skill could not alter the strategic reality. Transferred to the defense of the Reich in 1944, he encountered the P-51 Mustang, the ultimate expression of the American fighter philosophy: long range, high performance, built in staggering numbers. In one engagement, he was nearly shot down by a Mustang pilot who used the same dive and zoom tactics the Thunderbolt had pioneered. Hartmann adapted, as great pilots do, but he was fighting a tide. He was captured by American forces in May 1945, and later handed over to the Soviets. The man who had mastered the art of individual aerial combat spent 10 years in Soviet prison camps, a final, bitter testament to the futility of individual brilliance against the weight of a mobilized world. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely a tale of an effective weapon. It is the story of a collision between 2 worlds. One world, embodied by men like Hartmann and Steinhoff, believed in the supreme value of the master craftsman, the knight of the sky, honing his skill and his machine to a razor's edge. The other world, embodied by Alexander Kartvel's flying tank and the mile-long assembly lines of Willow Run and Farmingdale, believed in the democratization of power. Good enough, built by millions, operated by thousands, survivable, replaceable, and utterly relentless. The Thunderbolt was the blunt instrument that shattered the myth of German technical and tactical invincibility. It did not win the war alone. No single weapon did. But it was the harbinger, the first undeniable proof that the war would be decided not in the realm of ideas or courage, but in the realm of raw, unstoppable production. When a German pilot looked up and saw not 1 or 2, but dozens of the big, blunt-nosed fighters circling high above, he wasn't just seeing enemy aircraft. He was seeing the manifest, physical proof of a fundamental truth. His nation had chosen to go to war with a factory that was also a continent, and the factory was winning. The final, devastating statistic was this: by the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the United States had produced more P-47 Thunderbolts than the Luftwaffe had possessed total fighter aircraft of all types at the peak of its strength in 1941. That was the arithmetic of the new warfare. That was the deafening roar of the armory being forged, and it drowned out, completely and forever, the refined song of the master swordsman.